There you go. Recording is in progress. The minutes of the previous meeting, which was just really a formality just to get things going. I assume everyone is okay with the minutes. Yeah, that's good. The agenda, there's really one main thing on the agenda, which we'll come to. Before we come to our speaker, I just want to run through applications for membership. It's quite a good interest in the group, which is fantastic. I'll just run through them with you. Patrick Miner, Friends of the Earth Scotland, Como UK. Como UK, I was looking up earlier, they provide mobility hubs. If Como UK are here, please get in touch afterwards. I'd quite like to speak to you. It sounds quite interesting what you do. Strathclyde Partnership for Transport, Disability Equality Scotland. We've also got the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland. I was being asked at the Standards Committee earlier whether we'd be including disability issues in the work we do. So I'm really pleased to see those two groups joining up. We've got the St Andrews Rail Campaign, Community Transport Association, Heritage Railway Association, Light Rail UK Group, and Transport Focus. And I am happy to nominate all those. Is everyone okay with that? Excellent. Okay, with that done, I think we'll move on to our speaker, who is Heather Cowan. And Heather is the head of climate change and just transition for Transport Scotland. She's going to be talking for probably about 15 minutes about the Scottish Government report that came out last week about reducing car, well, they say car kilometers, I say car miles, by 20%. So I'll just pass on to Heather, and then afterwards she'll take some questions. What I would ask is that the questions are not political. Heather's not here to give political views. That's for politicians to do, and Heather's not a politician. So Heather, over to you, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, and thanks for that introduction. And it sounds like I'm presenting at the first substantive of the group, having had that formal approval. So thank you for that opportunity. As you said, I'm going to talk about the Scottish Government's 20% car kilometre reduction by 2030 commitment, and I'm joined by my colleague Phil McCluskey, Head of Sustainable Transport Demand, for the Q&A session that follows the presentation. And I've got somebody slide sharing for me, so I'm afraid we've got the next slide, please, aspect. The policy outcome to reduce car kilometres by 20% by 2030 was first announced in the Climate Change Plan update in December 2020, and it's a world-leading commitment demonstrating the level of ambition needed for Scotland to reach net zero, which is on the next slide, Mary. The commitment to publish a route map to set out the approach to achieving this was published earlier this month. It's a draft route map for consultation, and it involves setting out different policy interventions to induce behaviour change to move away from private car use and towards active travel and public transport. The 20% reduction commitment is against the 2019 baseline, and the commitment also applies to all cars, not only those powered by fossil fuels. The commitment is to reduce car use goes beyond meeting climate change targets in terms of impacts. It seeks to address the negative impacts of an over-reliance on cars. These are experienced by everybody in our society, regardless of whether they enjoy the benefits of car use. I'll now talk about the evidence base that supports the need for the 20% car kilometre commitment. Next slide, Mary. The commitment is a behaviour change policy underpinned by Element Energy research commissioned by the Scottish Government, and which was published and accompanied by a ministerial statement in September last year. The research modelled a pathway for delivering the transport sector's emission envelope by 2030, which includes 20% car kilometre reduction. The report provides an independent assessment of what policy outcomes are required in order for the transport sector to make the transition to net zero, and in particular, the scale of the challenge to meet Scotland's statutory target to reduce emissions 75% between 1990 and 2030. It clearly states that technology alone will not be enough to meet the challenge, and that transformational behaviour change policies will be needed to meet the 2030 target. This slide shows the only model scenario which meets transport's share of the emissions envelope for 2030. The scenario requires rapid introduction of zero emissions technologies, passenger freight and vehicle kilometres travelled reduced with mode shift away from cars and planes to public and active travel, and it also requires reduced demand. The 20% commitment comes within a range of car use reduction scenarios. The UK Committee on Climate Change 6 Carbon Budget Report in December 2020 acknowledged the need for car use reduction, and the UK Committee on Climate Change's recent Scottish Progress Report noted that 20% commitment is very ambitious and goes well beyond ambitions on demand reduction elsewhere in the UK, and could bring benefits to the climate and for health and well-being of Scottish citizens. Another rationale, and this is on the next slide, is that the main alternative to reducing car demand is to remove petrol and diesel cars, but the phase out of petrol and diesel vehicle commitments by 2030 and hybrids will still lock fossil fuels into the system for years to come. Therefore, modelling shows that we need to do both to be able to meet the transport emissions envelope. The next slide demonstrates that mode shift to active travel on public transport is not sufficient on its own. This shows the Dutch model where success in cycling uptake, 29% trips compared to 2% UK, needs to be coupled with restrictions in cars. The graph shows that the carbon dioxide emissions remain high in the Netherlands despite the prevalence of cycling due to the absence of policies on car use. The next slide shows that this car kilometre commitment is building on sustainable travel hierarchy and sustainable investment hierarchy, and both of these were also embedded in the recent Strategic Transport Projects Review 2 recommendations. Sets out the need for mode shift to more sustainable modes to meet emissions targets, and for investment to be firstly be targeted at reducing the need to travel unsustainably. The Element Energy report that I've been talking about also concluded that behaviour change policy outcomes were needed, requiring a switch from private car to public, active and shared transport modes over the next decade. It also stated the case for major increase in mass transit and public transport modes. It's recommended that walking must become the preferred mode of choice for transport for short journeys. Cycling, and both bikes and e-bikes, must be a viable mode for both urban and inter-urban journeys. A mode shift, along with destination shifting, journey shortening and journey avoidance and car sharing, including mobility as a service, will be needed to support delivery of the 20% car kilometre reduction. So examples of journey shortening are through accessing local services instead of travelling further for amenities facilitated, for example, through 20-minute neighbourhoods, and journey avoidance, for example, video conferences or other online options instead of making a journey. It also highlighted pricing as an important factor in relation to the cost of electric fuels the current cost of fossil fuels. The next slide shows that zero emissions is therefore much more than electrification and technology, but crucially also about the behaviour change policies as we transition to the future. By creating a more sustainable future, one where communities and neighbourhoods are less dominated by cars, reducing our reliance on private car use can significantly improve the places we live and our quality of life. The benefits for communities which are less dominated by cars are well known. These include improved air quality and reduced noise, better health and well-being as a result of increased physical activity, reduced negative economic and social impacts of congestion and road danger reduction, increased opportunities for people of all ages, abilities and backgrounds to interact in improved areas of civic space. So that's the ambition. The next slide shows that in terms of where we need to target, the transport travel in Scotland 2009 statistics are shown here, and the percentage of journey made by purpose of travel. So the perception is that commuting is responsible for the majority of distance travelled. But when you look at across the board, this is not the case. Breakdown of journey by activity shows the need to address longer leisure-related journeys. During the pandemic, there was a shift to home working, reductions in commuter journeys, and attitudinal data and meetings such as this demonstrate continuing expect to work from home in the future. However, there's just transition considerations with such a switch regarding those without a suitable home working environment, which could lead to reduced access to jobs. And any switch would need to be linked to a fair work approach, as well as being linked to decarbonisation overall, to prevent a net worsening or increase in the domestic heating sector to prevent an emission switch. So while working from home can have a positive effect on transport emissions, the net reduction emissions impact of the shift to home working could be smaller than first hoped. So we need to look across the range of journey purposes in terms of that reduction. The next slide just emphasises this point. The scale of car use reduction that we're looking for has not been reached anywhere before and not on a countrywide scale, and needs to be achieved at pace in less than a decade. Destination shifting brings a large potential to transfer some of the medium length journeys, those which are perhaps unable to be switched to bus and active travel, journeys to shorter ones. Nevertheless, it's also important to acknowledge that a third of all surface personal distance travelled is counted for a mere 3% of journeys, and these are trips greater than 50 miles and are mainly comprised of leisure, including visiting friends and family, as well as day trips and holidays and business activities. The next slide highlights that it's important to recognise the inequalities in the status quo. This is one of the rationales for change. As we transition, we also need to centre the principles of the just transition throughout the route map and throughout how we take forward that activity. For people on the lowest incomes, 60% have no access to car. Of those with long-term health problems or disability, the figure is 46%. Younger and older people, women and certain minority ethnic groups are also less likely to have access to a car, including in rural areas. And the report that I've been talking about, the Element Energy report, highlighted we must ensure carefully designed policies to ensure equal access to zero emissions vehicles and to drive decarbonisation in all sectors fairly, so that no sector or its users are unfairly burdened by the cost of decarbonisation. And as we know, the worst effects of car use, air and noise pollution, road danger, community severance and congestion fall disproportionately on the most marginalised in our society. Children in Scotland's poorest communities are at 3 times higher at risk of death or injury while out walking or cycling. The next slide shows that survey research has demonstrated the public are engaged with the issues and identify public opinion in favour of exploring options in the context of addressing the climate emergency. Surveys show broad support if fairness and equality implications are considered. The public engaged with the issues of motoring prices at the Climate Assembly and came out strongly in favour of action to address problems with the current system. For Scotland's Climate Assembly, when given a choice between different policy measures, modal shift towards public and active travel is generally seen as the fairest and the most favourable. And one of Scotland's Assembly's top 5 goals to reach net zero was to implement an integrated, accessible and affordable public transport system and improve local infrastructure throughout Scotland. Those not willing to reduce car use, main concerns were around convenience and affordability of alternative transport options, and safety was an additional barrier to shifting to active transport options. I will now, having gone through quite a bit of the evidence that supports the 20% car kilometre commitment, I'll now touch on the approach that we've taken to the route map. If you want to go forward 2 slides. It sets out the behaviour change approach that we've taken to the delivery of the 20% car kilometre commitment. Individual behaviour change happens in the context of the social and material environments in which people live, and the route map sets out the interventions that will enable people to adopt better ways of living by creating a social and material context where reduced car use is a normal, easy, attractive and routine behaviour to adopt. Individual level and system level changes are of course interlinked. The interventions on our route map have been selected in light of what the evidence tells us is effective in supporting change in travel behaviour, as well as insights from initial community engagement. And the route map was also developed in collaboration with COSLA and engaging with local authorities and regional partners, reflecting the need for national, regional and local interventions to delivery of car use reduction. This is a cross-sector effort as well. Not all the policy levers and answers rest in transport. Demand derives from other factors where people live, work, learn and access goods and services are all key to their need to travel. So next slide moves on to the route map. It's been developed around a framework of 4 behaviours that we want to support in order to reduce overall car kilometre reduction. These are reducing the need to travel, living well locally, switching modes, combining or sharing trips. We recognise that different behaviours would be more feasible in different geographical locations and for individuals with different needs. Supporting and encouraging people to achieve these changes forms the basis of 30+ interventions identified in the route map. I'm just pausing on that a bit because there was a lot of information in the side, but the 20% is a national, it's fine for the next one, 20% is a national ambition. The reduction target does not mean car use in rural or remote areas is expected to drop at the same rate as towns and cities. We will work closely with COSLA and local government on delivery as we have in the development to identify what's most appropriate to their local circumstances. I think we've already seen Edinburgh and Glasgow start to look at how they can go to 30% car kilometre reduction within their urban areas. But it may be necessary for delivery of the route map to develop a distinct approach to car kilometre reduction for different geographical areas, as well as considering potential equality impacts. The route map, which we published in draft, is now out for 12-week consultation, along with draft impact assessments. The next slide shows a selection of the cross-sector interventions in the route map focused on investment and legislative change. The full list of interventions can be found in the route map document, which is available on Transport Scotland's website. Some of these interventions are already underway, including providing free bus travel for people aged under 22, including, for example, reaching 100% broadband commitments. Other actions will take longer, but our commitment is backed up by significant long-term investment, such as the 10% of the total transport budget on active travel by 2024-25, helping more people to walk, wheel or cycle instead of drive. Again, quite a lot of information in that slide, but the final slide before I hand back to Graham Simpson, MSP, as chair, is acknowledging the scale of the challenge. The evidence is clear that car use can only be reduced at the scale and pace required by introducing measures to manage demand. Incentivising other modes will not be sufficient. The current motoring tax regime has been identified as a major barrier to the decarbonisation of the sector. We also acknowledge that public transport costs have risen above inflation over the last decade, while motoring costs have not. Fuel duty and vehicle excise duty remain reserved to the UK government, and the UK government has acknowledged within the UK Net Zero review that as we transition away from fossil fuels, structural changes to our tax system will be required, as well as committing to ensuring that motoring tax revenues keep pace with the change brought about by transition to zero emissions vehicles. However, no timescales for reform have yet been set out. The Scottish Government has committed within the route map to commission research, which will allow for the further exploration of equitable options for demand management to discourage car use, including on pricing. This research will help inform the development of a new framework for car demand management by 2025. It will also enable engagement with the UK Government on a future motoring tax system consistent with Scotland's climate change and just transition objectives, and to incentivise the transition to zero emission vehicles and protect future revenues to fund policies that can support a shift to more active and public transport. So just finishing on that on a factual basis, the need for pricing to be part of the interventions in terms of the evidence supporting the need for that approach. I hope that was a useful introduction to the discussion that you'll now have, and I'll hand back to Chair. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Heather. I know that was a whistle-stop tour at quite high level, but I don't know if you can see the chat box, because there are a number of questions in there. I think perhaps if we just cover them rather than me inviting people to make speeches, I'll just run through the questions that have been posed already, and we can have a sort of start off with a quick fire round if you if you like. So Ian Budd was wanting to know what's the percentage increase in rail passenger numbers needed to achieve the 20% reduction. James Harkins is making the point that there's some evidence that trams are very effective at getting modal switch 20% to 28%, and he references Nottingham. So I wonder if you could address that point. Paul Tetlaw is asking about cycle couriers and wants to know if Transport Scotland's done anything on that. James Harkins again, stats only show CHG emissions, wary of fine particulate figures. I suppose James understands that question. I think you covered road pricing. Jim Densham, well, actually, Jim Densham is asking if Scotland has the power to introduce road pricing. Perhaps you could cover that. Ian McCall asked about the workplace parking levy. That's actually going, I can answer that one, Ian. That regulation is going through Parliament at the moment, or the rules that would allow councils to set up schemes are going through Parliament at the moment. Colin Howden seems to be asking, answering the question on the Transport Act. I think that's enough for you, Heather. If you want to cover
yeah, there's a lot there, and
yeah.
I'll see whether my colleague Phil McCloskey wants to come in on any of them. I suspect what we can do is offer to come back, given that they're quite detailed and quite specific. So
Yeah.
in terms of the shift to rail, the Element Energy Research did set out as part of the pathway to 2030 the need for mode shift. So that does include mode shift on rail. I've not got the figures to hand, but I'm happy to follow up.
It's about double for rail, but I think we would just sort of emphasise that the Element Energy report is sort of indicative. It's not, we're not adopting that as a Scottish Government policy, but in terms of what we need to do by 2030, it would be more or less double current rail kilometres travelled.
And that focus is on mode shift in the context of car kilometre reduction, because decarbonisation of the rail network of course is important, but in terms of actually the shift away from car to rail is much more in that mode shift and that need to move onto mass transit modes. The next one I think was trams. Again, I think the evidence supports the need for mass transit modes in being able to reduce emissions and being able to support mode shift away from car. So yeah, happy to have further demonstrations of that. In terms of cycling couriers, I think they're being considered within the context of last mile delivery. So we didn't get into freight aspects within the route map itself, but that's not to say that work and that consideration isn't going on elsewhere. And on the specific fine particle stats, I would have to come back separately on that. On, I think, a number of those other questions, as you said, Transformer coming back on. So the workplace parking licensing regulations were part of the route map, and those regulations are now in place, but the guidance is still being developed in terms of local authorities having the discretionary opportunity to take forward those powers.
Okay, there's a couple of hands up. I'm going to bring in Stephen Stewart. Stephen.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the presentation. I think it's great that Scotland's leading the way with this strategy and setting targets, and other parts of the UK could follow. My question's around about bus, because quite clearly from the presentation, public transport's critical to this strategy. Bus is critical to modal shift. But while we're looking at a longer term strategy here, it's influenced by short term factors, one of which obviously is the challenges that the bus sector is facing from COVID, both in terms of passenger volumes and consumer confidence in using services, as well as some of the mitigations for COVID having ingrained car use. So what I was interested in was what, in terms of the strategy, does that assume the current network footprint for bus and service levels? Because we're coming into a very critical phase as we come out of COVID. The bus sector and the services that communities depend upon have had funding to account for the reduced passenger volumes. And it's really important that, particularly with the new under 22 free bus travel scheme, that when we're trying to encourage people onto public transport, particularly young people, they've got the services that they've got access to.
Before you answer that, Stephen, have you got a connection to the bus industry?
Yes, sorry, I'm Stephen Stewart. I'm Director of Communications for Stagecoach, obviously one of the major bus operators in Scotland.
Thanks. Right, Heather, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think I think the question hit the point exactly. So yes, bus has a key role in terms of climate change emissions reductions and in supporting the mode shift from 20% car kilometre reduction. But we find ourselves in a difficult post-COVID recovery position, and the bus industry, you know, if you looked in a climate context, you would want for bus to play an increasing part in terms of the number of passengers that it carries, in terms of how it can contribute to that mode shift away from car and emissions reduction. So bus remains a priority for Scottish Government.
Sorry, and does the strategy assume the current bus network is in place throughout the period of the strategy through to 2030 with the current service levels that we've got today?
I think we may have lost Heather.
Frozen there, but I could just sort of come in quickly just to say, yes, it assumes current levels plus, and again, we would be referring to the element energy research, which points to, I think, so rail was double, but I think bus use would have to triple in order to get people out of cars at the required scale.
Thank you.
Bus use is going to have to triple and rail use is going to have to double. Okay. Stephen, I'm just going to ask you a quick question before I move on to other people. So you are with Stagecoach, and how is Stagecoach doing in terms of moving away from diesel onto electric vehicles or hydrogen even?
Yeah, it's a core part of our sustainability strategy that we announced in August. We actually had the Transport Minister, a former Transport Minister, help launch some of our new vehicles, that electric vehicles we're introducing into Perth. There's others that are going into Aberdeen and Kilmarnock. Obviously, electrifying our fleet and making use of other technologies like hydrogen for longer distance services is a critical part of our roadmap. And right across the UK, our target is to have a zero emission bus fleet by 2035. Obviously, the other thing I would point out is that modal shift to bus, whatever powertrain it has, is the way that we can radically and quickly reduce emissions across the country.
Thank you, that's very useful. While we're on buses, I see Christine McGlasson has said something. Christine, do you want to say something? I think you're with...
Yeah, I'm with Explore, but I'm the chair of CPT. Sorry, ill-timed police siren there. Yeah, I'm the chair of the Confederation of Passenger Transport as well. So yeah, it was just making the point that in terms of the strategy, I think it's great the strategy is there, and that, you know, you've got this group coming together to find ways to achieve it, because it is going to mean massive behavioural change, and that probably means making some political decisions that some people won't like. So how do you make them, make those changes? The point I was making there is that if it's about kind of, shutting off roads, making it more difficult, you need to be quite careful with that, because buses use the same roads as cars. Even if you're putting in cycle lanes, you need to be careful how you put them in, because narrowing a road will also impede a bus, etc., etc. So all these things need to be carefully thought through in terms of impact. I think Heather made a comment about public transport having gone up in cost over the last 10 years. It's evident that all bus companies have had to put in a huge amount of extra resource in terms of buses and drivers, because the journey speeds have slowed so significantly in the last 2 decades, and therefore costs have gone up, passenger numbers have gone down. So the only place you can get revenue is from fares. Now, I still wouldn't say, when you compare the cost of public transport to running a car, that it's expensive. It's not. It's extremely cheap, and certainly so in certain areas, like my own. But I think it's unless we can speed up those journey times and get rid of resource, you won't be able to solve that problem, and therefore attract more people back. So I'm just making that point about unintended consequences.
Okay, thanks, Christine. Now, Dave Defoe and Stuart Hay have been waiting patiently with their virtual hands up, and you can put yours down now, Stephen. So I'll bring in Dave.
Hi, thanks very much. We in Spokes were totally gobsmacked when the government came up with this commitment, because it is an incredibly tough commitment. We're also impressed by the amount of thought that's gone into the route map, even though it's a year after the commitment was announced. However, last year, Chris Stark, who's the head of the Climate Change Committee, as people will know, spoke to MSPs and said that the target is incredibly challenging, and his actual words were, reaching the target will not happen unless there's a combination of carrots and sticks. So I've got 2 questions on the combination of carrots and sticks. The first question is, as we were told in the presentation, there's going to be a framework for demand management in 2025. A framework isn't action. So it's really very difficult to see why we've got to wait till 2025 for the framework. Can we not have that in 2022, 2023? All the consultation, so that action can begin and we can run the sticks in combination with the carrots. And the second question, going on to one of the specific sticks, as one might call it, the route map rightly places quite strong emphasis on the role of car parking, the cost and the availability of car parking. And it says that the Scottish Government will support local authorities in this. What exactly does support mean? And local councillors are going to find it difficult to do, so can the Scottish Government not just support, but actually incentivise? Thank you.
Okay, 2 questions there. Heather, I think you're back now, are you?
Yeah, apologies for that. I'm on a different device.
Right.
So yeah, two good questions. So in terms of the evidence, yes, we need a scale and a pace of change. And yes, the evidence supports that pricing needs to be part of that in terms of the stick measures, which is why we've got the piece of research that we're looking to commission on that, and using to have that inform a demand management framework for Scotland. I hear stakeholders' responses in terms of the need for more in terms of stick measures, and I think we'll need to look at that in the context of the consultation responses that we get, and that immediate piece of research which we need to do first to inform the next steps in that regard. And then the second question on parking, yes, what we've done in terms of the approach to the route map is we've taken a very collaborative approach. So working with COSLA, and COSLA has taken the route map through its governance processes, and there's been quite clear as part of that in scope in terms of local government delivery is looking at
parking and other measures that are local government auspices. And I think what we mean in terms of the approach to route map and supporting is that we will, in terms of the imperative, provide as much as we can and by way of support for that in local authorities in terms of the evidence supports it, the policy supports it, and we'll work with local authorities on toolkits in terms of how we can support their activity to deliver the 20% car kilometre reduction and deliver the interventions in the route map.
Heather, are you looking at trying to reduce the number of parking spaces in towns and cities?
So I think road space realignment or reduction of road space is shown to support, so reduction of road space away from cars, away from parking to support other measures does show evidence-based wise that would be useful to support car kilometre reduction, yes.
Okay.
But you still need to provide access for those that need it in terms of, accessibility and inequality perspectives as well. And provide those, it's also about those public and sustainable transport alternatives to access then that town centre or, city centre in terms of being able to support our town centres and city centres as thriving places to live, work and socialise.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to bring in Stuart Hay now. Stuart.
Thanks for the opportunity today. Just a quick observation. It's a great macro policy in terms of national ambition, where I think the concern is that these things come unstuck at the micro level, the individual street level, and that side of things. What buy-in is there from councils? Will councils set their own targets for travel reduction in their own areas through their strategies? Are we likely to see that?
Stuart, can you just say which organisation you're from?
I'm from Living Streets, working
Living
for
Streets.
Yeah.
Heather? Oh, we've got a very nice picture of a garden there.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening then. But I've got my mute off so I can answer that. So in terms of the 20% as the national ambition, we're not requiring local authorities to set it at a local level because we realise that there'd be geographical variances in terms of how much different local authorities can contribute, but we have seen local authorities start to talk about how they can contribute to the 20% as a national target, because we've seen that with Glasgow and Edinburgh talking about 30% car kilometre reductions, recognising that a bigger proportion of that needs to come from from urban areas.
Okay, Stuart.
Okay, that's useful to know. Thanks for that response.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Claire Daly, and Claire's from Sustrans.
Hi there. Yeah, I hope it's a fairly quick question, but Heather, I noticed in the kind of analysis that you had the breakdown of the different kind of types of journeys. There's the 5 to 35, there's the 0 to 5 mile journeys, and then there's 5 to 35 and over 35. Even though 30% of the emissions come from that 3% of the journeys, which is the over 35 journeys. Is there a breakdown of the 5 to 35 mile journeys, or we could say 8 to 55 kilometre journeys? We want to be stay with the vehicle kilometres. The reason I ask that is obviously e-bikes can expand the range of distance that can be travelled for most ordinary people by bike, the non-Chris Hoy types. So is there a breakdown? Is there a further breakdown of those figures? And then another thing that I haven't seen in the kind of analysis, but maybe it's referred to, is types of vehicles, because obviously we can talk about reduction in vehicle kilometres, but the impact of a reduction of getting SUVs off the road, as well as making our cities and towns much more walkable and cyclable, they'll obviously have a bigger carbon emissions reduction impact. That's the question.
I can comment on that one, on the breakdown of journeys. So we don't have that information at the moment. However, we can ask our brilliant statistical team in Transport Scotland to produce that. So happy to ask them to do it, and then can share with you if that's useful.
Yeah, it would be.
So that would be drawn just from the Scottish Transport Stats and the Transport and Travel. And then on SUVs, yeah, we recognise this as an increasing problem, because the increase in general size of vehicles is cancelling out any kind of gains that we're getting in terms of fuel efficiency in smaller cars. Unfortunately, vehicle registration is completely reserved to Westminster, so we don't have a lot of control over it. But we are sort of obviously talking to DFT and trying to take it that way. But yeah, that's about it.
Okay, is that okay, Colette? Okay, that'll be great to get those stats if we can get those. That'll be great. Okay, the next person with their hands up is JA's iPad. JA iPad, do you want to give your full name and organisation and ask your question?
Hello, Jane Ann Liston, the Starlink, St Andrews Rail Link campaign. I think surely the difficulty is, until now we've all been, and we still are to an extent, being encouraged to travel further for things, further for services, so we get centralisation. If you're looking for work, you're expected to travel for 90 minutes or you will lose your benefits. So it's all this sort of thing, and that doesn't quite go with 20-minute neighbourhoods. So I'm wondering how on earth we address this sort of thing, because there's some things that we now have to travel further for. You can't do it over the phone. I think what we need to avoid perhaps is a silo mentality, whereas the transport and environment people are saying, yes, we've got to reduce this. Other parts of government and society are saying, yes, but you've got to travel further. And the simple question I have to ask was about, how far do you think it's reasonable to assume someone who is not super fit and an Olympic athlete to either walk or cycle for a journey? Because I hear a lot about walk or cycle rather than drive a car. Fine, but how far are you meaning?
Oh, that's a good question, Jane. Blimey, that depends how fit you are, doesn't it? But anyway,
it does.
Does Heather's Garden want to answer that question, or does Phil want to take it?
I was wondering whether some of your attendees might want to take that, given the active travel and cycling specialty. But I think what we are realising is that the advent of e-bikes does enable longer distances to be travelled, and to have more of that opportunity with the e-bike to have alternatives to car over a longer distance. But I suspect you've got some other attendees that would be better answering the how much question.
I think you're probably right, and everyone will have a different view. Thomas Cornwallis there from Go Bike, he may be one of these super fit guys who thinks 30 miles is nothing. You've got your hand up, Thomas.
I wouldn't say 30 miles is nothing, but Go Bike Go Bike's the Strathclyde cycle campaign, and we mostly would talk about 20 minutes, because 20 minutes is 5 miles for the average person, and that's on a non-electric assisted bike. So in a city like Glasgow, for example, 5 miles does get you quite far across the city. And if you add into, as we're talking about, increasing bus and train usage, if you put these two things together, a lot of areas can be covered very quickly if you mix two modes of transport together. And I think that's something that's really important. And that's where us as a campaign group focus on, because I live 10, 15 minutes from my nearest railway station. Add in someone using a bike, they're there within minutes and they're on a train and they can be anywhere. So I think as a cycling campaign group, that's what we would see, is 20 minutes for a short distance is an acceptable distance to have to time to spend cycling somewhere.
Okay. Was
I
that
have to allow 40 minutes to cycle between St Andrews and Lookers railway station. And that's over 5.5 miles. So I'm not as speedy as that young gentleman there. So this is the sort of thing I'm meaning, that ordinary people, we've got to be realistic, and yet we're expected to travel 90 minutes to go to work.
No, I get it. It's a fair point. Thomas, was that the point you wanted to make? I brought you in on.
I just realised I forgot. I said miles, not kilometres. Sorry, it's 5 kilometres. For 20 minutes, so 3 miles. Sorry. My point was going to be that Glasgow has just published its Transport 100 policies, and inside that policy, there's points about trying to improve enforcement. In Scotland right now, we can't use camera enforcement for things like school streets and parking enforcement. So if we want to try and improve and reduce car usage, we need to improve the ability for councils to enforce the rules, because there's no point in having school streets to promote active travel, but not having the ability to enforce it without having active police officers on the street. So what's Transport Scotland's working with trying to improve policies in Scotland to use active camera enforcement?
Who wants that one?
I don't know the answer to that one, I'm afraid.
Okay.
But we can find out and come back on camera enforcement.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if there's stuff, if you don't know and you can find out, you can come back to us, because at the end of this, we're having a series of meetings which will end up in a report with recommendations, which may well come to Transport Scotland. And we want, as a cross-party group, to work with you. But, I'm going to bring in. We have to finish by 2 o'clock, by the way, folks. So I'm going to just bring in Jim Densham next, and then David Hunter.
Hi, yeah, thank you. It's Jim from Cycling UK here. So my question is, it's really good that what you've done is looked at the impact of people's changing habits of travel because of the pandemic. It's just like, how will you continue to monitor that and then change any of the interventions or adapt what you're going to do in light of further changes that might happen? What I was hearing anecdotally yesterday was that there's less people commuting at certain times of the day, but then at other times of the day they're at home, so they jump in their car to go to the shop at lunchtime, and you see more congestion at lunchtime, which doesn't really, it just changes the pattern of congestion, which is a real problem. So how are you going to sort of continue to monitor and build in that into your program, I guess?
Yep, I can comment on that one as well. So basically the route map is the starting point, and we'll continue to sort of build on it and add further interventions. So what we're working towards, I suppose, initially is we'll see how we get to by 2025, and then build a review cycle into it. By that stage, you'll have a lot of technological change that we're not aware of now. You'll have changes to the wider regulatory landscape, presumably in terms of Westminster changing the changes to the motoring tax regime. And obviously, as you say, I mean, this is quite a difficult moment in time to be trying to predict travel patterns for the next few months, let alone to 2030. And as you say, this is something that we've noticed as well. We thought at the beginning of the pandemic, you might see quite substantial reductions in car use because more people working from home. But that, as you say, hasn't happened because people are sort of, there's some kind of other effect going on where people who are working at home are then deciding that they need to go and visit friends or family during the day in their car instead. So we're pretty much back to where we were in terms of car levels. And again, we don't know how that's going to play out in the next few months if we move to some kind of hybrid working system. So we just keep it under review. We've got the route map out for consultation, and that will feed into a sort of a monitoring and evaluation framework which we'll develop over the next 6 months as well, working with RTPs, regional transport partnerships, as well as see what would be useful for them and local authorities.
Okay, thank you. I'll bring in David Hunter. David, you'll have to be the last questioner just because of time. So apologies to anyone else who wanted in, but there'll be plenty of other opportunities to have you say. So David, off you go.
Right, thanks very much for that privilege. So the question of behaviour change is one obviously that needs to consider the impacts on different people and their different abilities to change. For many disabled people, we know obviously that many disabled people are much more reliant on their private cars, but also the question about how far we should expect people to travel is a really good one, because that doesn't just depend on the person, but it depends on the infrastructure and their environment. So one of the really big problems for disabled people getting around, whether it's their own neighbourhood or getting to the bus stop, is the state of pavements and just the local pedestrian infrastructure. So we've really got to kind of take account of that and make sure that there's investment in these kind of bread and butter environments if we expect a lot of disabled people who would like to contribute to this agenda to be able to.
David, that's a really good point. You're from the Mobility and Access Committee for Scotland. Yeah, okay. Do you want to take that, Heather or Phil?
I think it's a valid point in terms of coming in. Which is why we need to work across national, local governments and cross sectors in terms of having that place-based approach, so that the places that people can access without using their car are accessible to them. And we're happy to continue to engage on accessibility considerations with Max and with others. I think we're due to come to the full Max committee meeting in May to talk about 20% car kilometre route map there. So happy to touch on this and other aspects at that meeting as well.
Oh, that's good. Can I barge in on that meeting, David? You might want to invite me to that. That sounds interesting. Good, thumbs up. Just contact my office. Right, okay. Heather, is there anything you want to say in closing?
I think other than thank you for the opportunity to come here and have this wide-ranging discussion with such a cross-sector of membership. I think that's been really appreciated, and apologies for my connectivity issues, being chucked out of one device and then joining with another device during that, but hopefully that hasn't impacted too much, because it seems a good quality debate and discussion that we've had here today. Yeah,
really appreciate your time, and actually the view of your gardens being very soothing. So anyone who thought they might get irate has not got irate. So thank you for that. And Phil as well. We really appreciate you both coming along. Can I just ask Colin Howden from Transport Scotland just to say where we go from here? Colin, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Transport Scotland. So am I getting a pay rise? Am I? Transform Scotland.
I'll just remind you, Colin, you're the secretariat for this group. So in terms of next meetings, so there will be another one in probably a month's time.
Yes, the next meeting will be at 1 o'clock on Thursday, 24th of February. And then there will be another 2 meetings later in the spring. The next meeting will likely be on traffic demand management. So taking on some of the points that Heather made towards the end of our presentation. We're just in the process of confirming speaker now, and you'll all receive the invite to the meeting very soon.
That's tremendous. Thank you very, very much. Apologies that we have to finish, but Parliament is due to sit in a minute, so I'll have to dash off. Appreciate everyone turning up. The restrictions in Parliament are easing a bit. Hopefully in the next 2 or 3 months we'll be able to, you know, meet in person, but this format does, you know, it does have its uses, but we can mix it up. But I think possibly the next one will be virtual. So we'll see in a month's time, and if anyone's got, you know, if anyone has sort of got a burning point they didn't manage to get across, feel free to get in touch. And in answer to the question, can we share the slides? Yeah, I think we can share those slides. Much of that's in the public domain anyway. So we'll get those out to people. With that, we'll close the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.